Welcome everyone. I'm Judy Putt. I'm a research fellow in the Department of Pacific Affairs and convener of this research seminar series. Anthony and I at least are in Canberra and on Ngunnawal land, so in Ngada Dindi Dawara, Ngunnawal in Jamara Jinyan. This is the fourth seminar in our Department of Pacific Affairs research seminar series this year. It is on the post-referendum consultations between the Papua New Guinean and Bougainville governments. And I really love it when I get to hear from someone who can draw on a lifetime of experience and expertise. And our presenter is certainly that. Anthony Regan is a constitutional lawyer with more than 40 years experience in matters connected to Bougainville's governance and future. I'd ask you to note that the seminar is being video and audio recorded. And before Anthony starts, I'd just also like to mention that if you could please ask your questions in the chat box. And at the end of his presentation, I will read not necessarily all of them, but some of them out. Okay, over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Judy. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining in and giving this opportunity to provide really what's an update on the implementation of the Bougainville Peace Agreement. We're really dealing with an analysis of what's provided in the Bougainville Peace Agreement and the Papua New Guinea Constitution for the handling of the situation following the referendum on independence. The referendum was intended to resolve the dispute both amongst Bougainvilleans and between some Bougainvilleans and Papua New Guinea about the political future of Bougainville. But of course, the referendum itself was not binding on Papua New Guinea, no matter how significant the support for independence. And the Constitution and the Peace Agreement provide for engagement between the two sides after the referendum to reach some final decision on the future political status of Bougainville. And so we're essentially dealing today with that post-referendum consultation and engagement process, which has already begun. The first meeting between Papua New Guinea and Bougainville was held in May in Kokopo in East New Britain, and the second meeting is scheduled to happen next week now on Tuesday in Wabag in Enga province. You'll forgive me for not having a PowerPoint to share with you. I don't believe that PowerPoints are always essential, and sometimes the presenter can do their best to be entertaining with the content without a PowerPoint, and I'll do my best in that regard. There has been actually a fair bit happening in the last week as the technical teams from both Bougainville and Papua New Guinea engage in preparations for the meeting next week. And I've been keeping in touch quite closely with what's happening, lots of conversations, emails, and other interactions to keep track of things, which has informed what I'll be talking about today. It's quite a fast-moving process, but it's not quite clear yet what the agenda will be for next week, so I won't be going into that very much. Undoubtedly, at the very centre of what's discussed next week will be the Bougainville position put forward at the first consultation meeting in May, which in essence is that Papua New Guinea should agree to Bougainville becoming independent by mid-2025. Bougainville wants PNG agreement to independence, with that agreement clearing the way to recognition of Bougainville independence by the international community, thereby ensuring Bougainville can gain membership of the UN. That's very clearly in their sights. And Bougainville's well aware of the dangers of a unilateral declaration of independence not being recognised by the international community. After all, they've had experience of two such unilateral declarations, one in September 1975 and one in May 1990, neither of which got recognition. Indeed, the foremost international law expert on state recognition, the recently deceased Australian Professor James Crawford, stated in his 2007 book on the recognition of new states that, and I quote, "No new state formed since 1945 outside of the colonial context, decolonising states, has been admitted to the United Nations over the opposition of the predecessor state." So in other words, agreement from Papua New Guinea is very important if Bougainville is to have a smooth path towards UN membership, which is the, if you like, ultimate recognition of independence. So the focus on this seminar is on understanding the point reached in dealing with the dispute over the future political status of Bougainville, which stretched back over many years, and in particular the point reached in an agreed process for dealing with that dispute that was provided for in the Bougainville Peace Agreement of 30th of August 2001, and given constitutional status through amendments to the PNG Constitution, very long and detailed amendments, longer than many actual full national constitutions. Those amendments were passed by the PNG Parliament in 2002. In the context of comparative constitution resolution of the increasingly more complex, violent internal conflicts that have occurred around the world since World War II, the success of the 20-year-old Bougainville Peace Agreement in ending the multifaceted violent conflict in Bougainville has been remarkable. In fact, more than 60% of post-World War II conflicts, internal conflicts, have resumed within 5 years of a peace agreement. The Bougainville experience is widely regarded internationally as a remarkable success. The UN, which played a significant role, sees it as one of its great success stories in peacemaking. And the UN, as we'll see, is deeply involved in the current post-referendum consultation process, not only in chairing the meetings, which is what it's doing, but in a wide range of other activities. A significant part of the success of the Bougainville Peace Agreement lies in the fact that the BPA has, from the beginning, substantially been honoured. Its provisions, for the most part, as expressed in that long constitutional amendment, have been implemented. The gradual progress in the implementation of the agreement and of the constitutional arrangements has built commitment amongst Bougainvillians to what the peace process has provided for, and has enabled the Bougainville government to bring dissident elements who are opposed to the peace process into the peace process. Mekamui government elements in particular supported the referendum and encouraged their members to vote in the referendum, and largely because of the success in getting towards the referendum implementation. While the implementation of the autonomy arrangements have been very important, and despite some aspects having been fairly disappointing, it's the provisions on the deferred steps in addressing the core dispute about independence that concerns us here. In brief, what was agreed in 2001 was that the issue of independence would be dealt with by a referendum for Bougainvillians on the future political status of Bougainville. And the referendum would be deferred for a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 15 years after the establishing of autonomy, which was 2005. So it meant there was a window between 2015 and 2020 when the referendum had to be held. The actual date in that 15-year, in that 5-year window, 10 to 15 years, would be determined by the two governments taking account of progress in weapons disposal and the achieving of good governance by the Bougainville government. The referendum had to include an option of a separate independence for Bougainville, but there could also be other options. And the referendum would be conducted by an agency agreed to between the governments. And it was agreed that the outcome of the referendum would not be binding on PNG, and that instead, following the referendum, there was going to be a possibly 3-step process which could deal with the outcomes. Now, here we're at the heart of what's been agreed for handling the outcome of the referendum. And unlike the rest of the peace agreement and the constitutional amendments, there's very little detail about what happens after the referendum. There's merely a very sketchy outline of a possibly 3-step process. The first step is consultation between the two governments about the outcome of the referendum. The second step is, if the consultations agree, and it's possible for the consultations to say otherwise, if they agree, it goes to the Parliament. The results are tabled in the Parliament. Now, the Constitution doesn't say this, but the peace agreement does. It says that the Parliament has the power to ratify the outcome. And ratify makes you think immediately that it's got the power to approve. But what in fact it says is ratify, and then in brackets, meaning final decision-making authority by the Parliament. And then the third possible step is that there's a dispute settlement mechanism in the peace agreement and the Constitution, which applies to all kinds of disputes. And it's specifically stated that there's differences about the referendum, either before or after, then they can be dealt with by the dispute settlement process, which involves arbitration and mediation, and then possible final decision-making by the Supreme Court. Very unclear how the dispute settlement mechanism would be used and how it would operate if there was such a dispute. So they're the key points about what's happening now. Now, it's important to note that the Papua New Guinea government did a good job of working with the Bougainville government to implement the referendum provisions. That's despite, at one stage, Peter O'Neill, Prime Minister, indicating that the weapons disposal and good governance evaluation issues could result in it being impossible to hold the referendum. He said this in September 2017, but nothing ever happened along those lines. The agreed provisions have been implemented pretty faithfully. Many major decisions made, for example, about the Bougainville Referendum Commission, about the questions to be asked, the 2 options of independence and greater autonomy. And the referendum was held in late November and early December 2019. And as many of you will be aware, the outcome was a 97.7% vote for independence on a very high 87.4% turnout, all in relation to a remarkably accurate roll of voters, and the conduct of the referendum being adjudged to be free, fair, legitimate and transparent, and adjudged as such by independent observers. Now that outcome is remarkable when it's remembered how divided Bougainville was on its future political status at the stage when the peace agreement was being negotiated. And a big reason why there's a long deferral of the referendum for up to 15 years was because of agreement between the Bougainville parties that they needed time to unify before the referendum was held. So after the referendum was held, it was expected that the next step, the intergovernmental consultation on the outcome, would begin soon after. And there was a 40-day period in which legal challenges to the outcome of the referendum could be filed, and it was thought that the negotiations, or the consultations, sorry, not negotiations, would begin probably in February of 2020. because it was expected that the consultations would begin so quickly, there had been established in mid-2018 a joint task force of the National and Bougainville governments to prepare for the referendum, the post-referendum consultation. It was called the Joint Post-Referendum Planning Task Force. It was chaired by the relevant ministers of the National and Bougainville governments, and it met 8 times in 2019, mapping out how the engagement might happen, who would chair it, who would moderate it, what the basic principles would be, what kind of secretariat support would be needed. And the feeling was they were all ready to go. But in fact, there was a long delay. The consultations didn't happen in early 2020, but began in May 2021. And there was a number of reasons for this. The first reason for the delay was attempts by the Bougainville government to change the constitution of Bougainville to do away with a 2-term limit on presidential office, with a view to John Momis, who'd been president for 2 terms, holding office for a 3rd term. The government failed to get amendments through the Bougainville House of Representatives. And so thereafter, a Supreme Court challenge was launched, claiming that the 2-term limit was an unfair fetter on the right to stand for public office. The Supreme Court met and decided the matter quite quickly, finding that there was no justification that the 2-term limit was a reasonable restriction on the right to stand for public office. The second major issue that's delayed things was COVID and lockdowns and so on. The next was a Bougainville general election, deferred from mid-year until September, deferred because of the constitutional issue about Momis and also by COVID. And then, of course, in late 2020, there was a constitutional and political crisis in Port Moresby. So it wasn't until late December of 2020 the pressure began to build on the national government to get ready for holding the consultations. In January of 2021, there was a meeting between Marape and Tarama, and they signed a joint communique about holding the consultations. It didn't say very much more than repeat general history of the referendum and the outcome of the referendum. It did, however, pick up on proposals emerging from the work of the Post-Referendum Planning Task Force. It indicated that the consultations would be moderated by an appointed moderator. It didn't refer to the fact that the former Irish Prime Minister and chair of the Referendum Commission, Bertie Ahern, had already been invited. It also indicated that the consultations would address the key issues on the future political status of Bougainville and the method of endorsement by the National Parliament. So we're coming back to this question of what happens when the outcomes of the consultation, if they're agreed to, go to the Parliament. So the communique in early January of 2021 suggested that consultations would begin soon, but nothing happened until May. And in the ensuing months, there was gradual concern building up in Bougainville that the national government was doing nothing. And there were murmurings about a possible UDI amongst some people. Not that anything was very seriously said to that effect, but it gives you an idea of how jumpy people were getting. In April, the UN stepped in and encouraged the national government and the Prime Minister Marape to get ready to engage with the Bougainville government and agree on dates for a consultation. And as a result, on the 28th of May, Marape and Tarama met. And they agreed there was a need for resources to support the consultation process. They agreed that there was a need for each side to understand the composition of the teams that would conduct the negotiations. They announced they'd agreed on Bertie Ahern as the moderator. And until then, it had been thought that the moderator would also be the chair. but now it emerged that the UN was going to be playing critical roles with the process and would be the chair for the consultation. So it became clear that the moderator's role would not include chairing and would be limited, if you like, to conflict resolution, information provision, and so on. It was agreed that both the government technical teams would meet in May, and the first consultation would be held on the 17th of May. Though PNG had been developing a complex structure of bodies to support a core national government consulting team, the unexpected death in February of Dr. Henry Okole, who many of you will know, who was the head of the Office of Bougainville Affairs, delayed finalisation of those arrangements of the national government. And by the time the first meeting was held in May, they just had a consultation team and nothing else. On the Bougainville side, both the Momis-led Bougainville government up until August 2020 and the Tarama-led government from September had been doing a lot of work on their consultation structure. And they've, out of this, agreed on a consultation team, a large representative consultation team of about 28 people with just 4 or 5 identified as speakers. There's a technical advisory support team, there's a joint consultation secretariat, and there's a Bougainville Consultation Forum, a very broad-based advisory consultative body covering regions, interest groups, churches, and so on. It reflects the experience of the Bougainville Peace Agreement negotiations, the need to involve a wide range of interest groups. So the first meeting began on the 18th of May, and in the week before, there was a meeting about another important matter, the signing of an agreement between the two governments to speed up the transfer of powers and functions available under the autonomy arrangements. That was signed between Tarama and Marape. It was known as the Sharp Agreement. Then at the meeting, Tarama made an opening statement. He reflected on the history of the peace agreement, its implementation in the cooperative way. He talked through the referendum results and said it reflected a rejection of greater autonomy, and that Bougainville, having lived under the actual autonomy arrangements for 16 years, also rejected them. The referendum was said to be a democratic expression of a united Bougainville demand for independence. And it called for independence to occur through election of the members of a parliament for the independent state of Bougainville by June 2025. A declaration of self-government for Bougainville would be made in June 2022, although it wasn't clear what that would involve. There would be a transfer of all outstanding powers under the autonomy arrangements through the Sharp Agreement by 2022. Marape responded in an off-the-cuff address. He didn't have a paper prepared. Apparently the prepared paper was set aside so he could speak off the cuff. He didn't reject Tarama's stated position in favour of independence, but expressed 3 main concerns. One was that secession by Bougainville would be a precedent for other parts of PNG, especially resource-rich areas, which could lead to the dissolution of PNG. A second was that separation of Bougainville could rupture families and other relationships. The third was that Bougainville was lacking the capacity and financial revenue basis to stand on its own. 2 days of statements followed. Bougainville had 5 speakers who supported Tarama. PNG had several speakers. They had advanced, diverse positions, some more than others seemingly a bit sympathetic to Bougainville, which was a bit surprising. At the end of the meeting, at the end of the second day, President Tarama tabled a short 2-page timeline of steps towards independence and full UN membership by 2025. He wanted self-government by 2022 filled out a little here. indicating that this would involve establishing a Bougainville Constituent Assembly, which would develop an independence constitution to be adopted in time to provide a basis for the election of an independent government for Bougainville in mid-2025. It was agreed that the next consultation would happen in mid-June in Wabag. The meeting was chaired by the UN, the UN resident representative, Gianluca Rampolla, and he was supported by a small UN team. After the Kokopo meeting, the PNG side did more work on setting up its consultation structures. And in addition to the consultation team, it's established an advisory body, a broad-based advisory body, and a broad-based eminent persons group. And hurried arrangements were made last week for induction of these two teams. The meeting, the second meeting should have happened in Wabag starting yesterday, but was delayed at the last minute because of the death of a member of the Bougainville government, Raymond Masono. But there was also an issue of PNG needing to prepare more. The technical team between Bougainville and the national government met last Friday, and the PNG officials tabled a timeline, a roadmap they called it, building on the roadmap or timeline that Torama had tabled at the first meeting in Kokopo. It's a little bit unclear what's going to come out of the timeline. The national government was pressing for a more spread out implementation of the various steps that Torama had put forward, pushing towards 2030. But it's not clear what the national government's position, what it would be offering to Bougainville in an alternative to independence. So the meeting next week will be about the steps Bougainville wants to advance, and it'll be also about possibly what alternative the national government wants to offer. I would expect it's going to become clearer that PNG opposition to independence will be made a little clearer. If that happens, it's hard to see how the difference in positions on independence will be resolved. And it's here that the role of a moderator as a conflict resolution person could become important. However, it's unclear how much of that role that Bertie Ahern, the nominated moderator, will be able to play. He's based in Ireland and involved in a number of conflict resolution situations in Europe, so is unwilling to travel to Papua New Guinea and Bougainville very often. The Bougainville government is proceeding to push very hard for the preparations for independence. It's developed a program called the Independence Ready program, and each member of the 40-member Bougainville House of Representatives has to develop their own Independence Ready program in their constituency, which involves holding a public meeting, which most constituencies have already done, to launch the program, to explain what Bougainville's doing towards independence, and to set up an Independence Ready committee in each constituency made up of the member of the House, along with the head of the community government for the constituency and heads of village assemblies from all over the constituency. And their role is to build awareness for independence and to encourage all Bougainvillians to become income-earning, tax-paying citizens to support progress towards financial stability for Bougainville, internal financial independence. Bougainville's also talking about moving fast on other resource projects, on getting a share of the revenue from tuna fishing licenses in its waters, is it's moving towards trying to get a budget of about 2 to 3 times the current budget, which is what it estimates, in part on the advice of Satish Chand from ADFA, It's roughly what they think they'll need for an independent government. There are issues about how realistic Bougainville is in terms of taking over powers, the autonomy powers under the Sharp Agreement, the powers in relation to judiciary and ombudsman and other institutions under the Constitution for Bougainville, which have yet to be acted upon, and to take over all the other powers of a national government, such as defence, policing, currency, foreign relations, etc. Apart from there being a likely serious issue on independence, there's also disagreement between the two governments on what ratification by Parliament means. If it goes to Parliament, PNG believes that the Parliament has ultimate authority. For Bougainville, the Parliament would only be required to ratify the outcomes of the consultation process. It wouldn't have the ability to do any more than that. So there's quite a difference on what should happen if it goes to Parliament. Then there's the possibility of differences going to the dispute resolution process. And as I said earlier, it's very unclear what this would mean. The difficulty that the two sides face really is that there's very little detail to guide the process now on this three-stage process. And the post-referendum task force that did work in 2019 and 2020 has not really filled out in much detail how it will happen. The real issue is, how do you deal with the results of a non-binding referendum in a way that satisfies both sides? Because we're looking for a final decision on Bougainville's future political status with uncertainty about how to resolve that. It's going to be very important, probably, for the moderator to be deeply involved in teasing out what happens between the parties. The role of the chair is probably quite limited. The UN is going to continue chairing the meeting, but the UN is seen as largely a ceremonial chair on the side of the Bougainville parties, and they would only want the moderator to do dispute resolution work. On the Bougainville side, there's a very strong sense of mission, a strong feeling that they've been waiting for independence for many years. They've done all that was required under the peace agreement, step by step, right up to the referendum. And now they seek to fulfill their mission. On the national government side, there's some difficulty, I think, in working out a coherent and unified position. We'll have to see whether that emerges before next week. What does all of this say about if we wanted to evaluate the Bougainville Peace Agreement and the linked constitutional provisions that implement it and their success in ending the conflict? I think we can say that it's most unlikely that violent conflict will emerge again. There's no appetite in the PNG government, in the PNG security forces, to return to conflict in Bougainville. The armed groups in Bougainville have disarmed. There's no appetite in Bougainville for a return to conflict. However, we're now back to really the position we were in just before the referendum arrangements were agreed to in the peace agreement in 2000, with a significant difference likely between the two sides, and a much stronger moral position for Bougainville that it was in then, with real unity on the question of what should happen going forward, but still the very same difficulties for Papua New Guinea in dealing with the Bougainville demand. Friends, I'll leave it there. That's an overview of what's been happening thus far in the post-referendum situation. an update, if you like. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.